Nagumo liked me and insisted that I should enroll in the Staff College. In those days, I never imagined that this officer, later Vice Admiral, would one day command great Japanese task forces in attacks on Pearl Harbor and Midway. Following the Midway debacle, Nagumo was subjected to all kinds of criticism. In my memory, however, he remains a brilliant and aggressive naval officer and a most kind-hearted man. Despite Captain Nagumo's daily interest and encouragement, I failed to pass the Staff College entrance examinations. Instead, in September 1932, I was appointed an instructor. This may sound puzzling, but such a development was not unusual in the Imperial Navy. My choice of this program meant that I was giving up the chance of a career as a headquarters staff officer to become a specialist. In the 3 years following my marriage, I had been tackling a private project. I did not discuss its details with anyone, knowing too well the audacity and the possible impact of my studies. I knew, too, that the reaction of my colleagues would be to scoff if they learned of my intentions. Captain Nagumo had encouraged me in preparation for the Staff College. I read every book he recommended, as well as his own dissertations on American mobilization potential, made during his studies in the United States. But I simply could not concentrate. I knew the importance of my private project, and it kept me from applying myself to other studies. Even with Captain Nagumo's support, I flunked the Staff College examinations. My project was completed in mid-1932. It had involved thousands of complicated calculations. In short, I had proved mathematically the faults of Japanese torpedo doctrine and established a new manual. The published results created a sensation in the Imperial Navy. It is very hard to establish new doctrine in a military organization. Most career officers trained in an old theory are conservative-minded and react unfavorably to anything new. I was exceptionally fortunate. There was practically no objection to my new theory, and the Imperial Navy torpedo manual was in fact scrapped and replaced with a manual based on the results of my work. Thus it was that I came to be assigned to teach my theory at the Staff College. I still take more pride in my achievement of correcting Japanese torpedo doctrine than in any other activity of my naval career, including my accomplishments in World War II. It is not easy to explain my theory in detail without using many calculations involving algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus. Simply told, however, it evolved in this way. After graduating from the Yokosuka Specialist School in 1923, I was generally assigned to destroyer duty, and usually as torpedo officer. I studied and trained religiously on the subject of torpedo firing. For almost 3 years, the torpedo manual was my Bible. Every week our squadron would go out on torpedo firing maneuvers. The torpedoes were fired without warheads as an economy measure, but were set to run just below the target to simulate a direct hit. After 3 years of intense training and practice, my score was such that I began to have doubts about my marksmanship. I seldom scored any direct hits. My early reaction at the failures was to berate myself and work harder to improve. I trained frantically until I could tell at a glance through binoculars the distance and speed of the targets. After checking my judgment with instrumental measurement and finding that I was accurate and still not scoring hits in practice, I began to be suspicious of the Navy's torpedo doctrine. A destroyer's punch is packed in its torpedoes. A destroyer, usually about 300 feet in length, knifes through the waves at 30 knots or more, closes on its enemy ship, opens fire with all guns, and finishes off the opponent with torpedoes. A Japanese destroyer carried only 16 torpedoes. From 2 sets of 4 torpedo tubes fore and aft, 8 fish could be released at 2-second intervals. Once the first set of 8 was released, it usually took about 10 minutes to reload the tubes. Therefore, a torpedo officer's assignment was very important. A destroyer's small guns are no match for the tremendous firepower of a battleship. If the first spread of 8 torpedoes fails to strike home, the odds are completely against the smaller ship. It would be sunk easily during the 10 minutes needed to reload the tubes. And that was how umpires of our war maneuvers ruled. My destroyer was thus sunk many times while I could only stand on the bridge, watch my fish miss the target, and grit my teeth. When I observed that other destroyer torpedo scores were as poor as mine, I gradually came to the conclusion that direct hits were little more than pure chance. I began to doubt the basic formula. The accepted doctrine was to cover a total spread of 20 degrees in firing the 8 torpedoes. After careful analysis of all the many factors concerned, I concluded that the 20-degree spread resulted in hits only if my destroyer, describing a hyperbolic curve at 30 knots, released its torpedoes at the peak of the hyperbola, at a target 2,000 meters distant, starting to draw away on an evasive curving course at 20 knots. Over a period of many weeks of manoeuvres, I discovered that the opposing squadron was apt to start its evasive turning before my ship was ready to release torpedoes. Also, I discovered the necessity of considering every element of computation anew, including the 2-second interval between each of the 8 torpedoes. This research was eye-opening for me. As my studies progressed, I applied each new step of my theory in our practice manoeuvres, and my marksmanship improved steadily. By the time I was serving under Captain Nagumo, I had achieved a reputation as the highest-scoring torpedo officer in the entire Navy. That was probably one reason why Nagumo was so interested in me, and why my theory was so readily accepted by the Navy in 1932. My manual revolutionized the Imperial Navy's torpedo doctrine. Within a year of its promulgation, there was an improvement in torpedo marksmanship throughout the Navy. A very important technical development for Japanese torpedo tactics came in 1933, when Rear Admiral Kaneji Kishimoto and Captain Toshihide Asakama of the Kure Torpedo Institute developed a torpedo propelled by oxygen instead of compressed air. This oxygen-fueled torpedo, a top secret of the Imperial Navy, was superior to the torpedoes of every other nation. The Japanese torpedo, in addition to being much faster and longer ranging than the best American or British torpedoes, had another great advantage. Ordinary torpedoes, driven by compressed air, leave a long, white, telltale track which is easily detected and evaded by a fast ship. But an oxygen-fueled torpedo runs without leaving a trace on the surface. The introduction of my new torpedo manual and the invention of the oxygen torpedo were a great boost for the morale of Japanese destroyer men. Ship design was being improved steadily at the same time, until destroyers were fast becoming the darlings of the fleet. Destroyer officers were no longer concerned about Japan's numerical disadvantage dictated by the last disarmament agreement. They realized the great supremacy of the Japanese destroyer fleet, which they figured would play a major role in any war to come. They failed to reckon with the miraculous development of electronic weapons by the United States and the overwhelming superiority of American air strength. These were the most decisive factors in determining the outcome of World War II. This is not to say that there was complacency in our efforts. Our training was more strenuous than ever in promoting familiarity with the new mighty torpedoes. Standard daily orders were to close within 500 meters of the target before releasing these long-range torpedoes. Every officer was told to recover the torpedo, even though in practice they were fired without warheads. We did obey this second order, because a single torpedo then cost 5,000 yen, 2,500. Moreover, we knew we must not take any chance that this torpedo might fall into alien hands and its secret be discovered. Sometimes an entire fleet would comb a wide area of the ocean for many hours to recover one errant torpedo. On stormy days, we even cancelled manoeuvres for fear that a torpedo might be lost. The orders for closing to 500 meters were not, however, taken seriously. I never heard of anyone doing it in manoeuvres, although later I sank 3 American destroyers by this method. The enemy's course during battle is too unpredictable. In order to torpedo his ship, the attacking destroyer must approach the course of his target, close quickly, fire, and then break off in a curve. A high-speed destroyer cannot slow down quickly to avoid a collision, and mid-ocean collisions are usually fatal. Also, to close with an enemy within 500 meters means braving dangerous gunfire. In maneuvers, we usually fired torpedoes at a range of about 2,000 meters. In actual warfare, the average distance was probably 4,000 to 5,000 meters, a distance which still outranged American torpedoes. In all fairness, however, I must cite the bravery of American destroyers. In my experience, they always tried to close to within effective range of their torpedoes. I was promoted to Lieutenant Commander on November 15, 1933. By this time, I was the father of 2 daughters. It was 12 years since my graduation from the Naval Academy, and I felt like a full-fledged Navy officer at last. It was elating to realize that, thanks to my work on torpedo doctrine, I was one of the youngest commanders in the Imperial Navy, and was even ahead of my classmates who had been admitted to the Staff College. For Japan, the period from 1931 through 1937 was marked by a series of internal and external troubles, which are now far more interesting to contemplate than they were to endure. These troubles were to culminate in the Pacific War. I cannot properly evaluate these fateful steps toward war because I lived through this period involved in my own studies and shipboard assignments. But a listing of the major events of those years may serve to indicate the path Japan was striding, headlong to war. On September 18, 1931, the Japanese army clashed with Chang Sui-liang's troops near Mukden, Manchuria. The fire of war quickly spread to the whole of Manchuria, where Japan destroyed the opposing Chinese troops and promptly established the puppet empire of Manchukuo. On May 15, 1932, a dozen young Army and Navy officers stormed his office and assassinated Conservative Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai. In March 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations after that world body had accused Japan of aggression in Manchuria. In December 1934, Japan notified the United States and Britain that she was scrapping the Naval Disarmament Agreement. In August 1935, Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Aizawa, a fanatic extreme rightist, walked into the office of Lieutenant General Tetsuzan Nagata, Military Affairs Bureau Chief in the War Office, and slew him with his sword. On February 26, 1936, hot-headed officers of the 1st Division attempted a coup d'etat. Divided into small groups, they stormed the homes of senior statesmen and assassinated 4 of them. This was the most grievous of Japan's internal incidents, but it fell short of the planned nationwide rebellion. As a lieutenant commander, I was given command of a destroyer for the first time on November 1, 1934. I served as judge in a Navy court-martial in 1934 and again in 1935, thereby acquiring some knowledge of law, so the 1936 coup came as a horrible shock to me. My destroyer, Nagatsuki, Long Moon, attached to the combined fleet, was then operating around southern Kyushu. Emperor Hirohito ordered the fleet to rush to Tokyo Bay. His Majesty was incensed at the attempted coup and sternly ordered the army and navy to crush it. Fortunately, the rebels surrendered before we had to fire on them. But I was dismayed at the gravity of the situation. I could no longer remain aloof, absorbed in my studies. The so-called China incident started on the 7th of July 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peiping. The army tried to keep the trouble contained in the vicinity of Peiping, but steadily growing anti-Japanese sentiment in China touched off incidents at several other places. On the 23rd of August that same year, I received my baptism of fire in a most unanticipated fashion. In that month, hordes of Chiang Kai-shek's army started an offensive in Shanghai against the Japanese residents, who were defended by about a division of Japanese Marines, actually Navy personnel trained for land operations. The Marine Division fought gallantly against heavy odds. For a time, however, it appeared that the Japanese were doomed, and the army commandeered a squadron of 4 destroyers to rush reinforcements from Nagoya to Shanghai. One of the destroyers in the command was a new ship. Amagiri, Sky Mist, was of the very latest design. Although I was generally conceded to be the Navy's top torpedo expert, my assignment to this ship had been a great and pleasant surprise. Amagiri, a 2,370-ton destroyer, picked up some 300 army troops, armed to the teeth. They were packed like sardines into every available space in the ship. The four-ship squadron eased stealthily out of the big commercial port of Nagoya at midnight and made the 1,000-mile voyage to Shanghai in 2 days at the economical speed of 20 knots. We sneaked into Shanghai harbour under cover of darkness, and I brought my ship quietly alongside a railroad pier at Wusung. The soldiers jumped quietly but quickly from the deck to the pier. Without warning, we were raked by bursts of machine gun fire from the top floors of a darkened building some 50 yards away. Amagiri's 6-127 mm. Guns promptly replied with ferocious salvos at the unseen enemy. Sweat streamed down my forehead as I issued orders from the bridge. It was fortunate that the enemy, apparently guerrillas or partisans, did not aim well. None of my men were hit, nor were any of the army troops. After a few salvos from our guns, the ominous building was silenced. I saw our soldiers dashing in with light machine guns, rushing into action, and ordered, "Pull away from the pier." We failed to achieve a surprise, but the landing was still effective. Our ships were followed by others carrying Nagoya's 3rd Division. 2 additional army divisions reached Shanghai from Kyushu. These efforts reversed the tide of battle, and the Chinese offensive petered out. The Japanese drove all Chinese forces from Shanghai. If the Japanese forces had stopped there, subsequent disaster might have been prevented. But the High Command lost its head, kept pushing to the west, and in December 1937 the army occupied Nanking. The wishful thinking of army officers proved wrong when Chiang Kai-shek did not surrender upon the loss of his capital. He merely retreated to Hankow, then to Chongqing, and kept resisting for 8 more years. While the army was pushing to Nanking, my squadron was employed to blockade the mainland coast. This assignment was quite dull, since our warships cruised completely unchallenged in Chinese seas. Once a week or so, we would halt a leisurely junk and inspect its cargo. If we found it to be carrying contraband, a few shells from the destroyer would sink the junk after its crew had been removed. As I say, the job was none too stimulating. In November, I took Amagiri back to Japan, and the following month I was assigned to command of Yamagumo, another brand-new destroyer. After shakedown, I returned to China waters and the blockade assignment. While the war continued relentlessly on the mainland, I made my monotonous daily cruises, glumly watching the world situation. That was all I could do. The Munich Conference was held in September 1938. In Europe, Adolf Hitler's power was rising. I was promoted to commander in November, but my monotonous China assignment continued until the end of March 1939. For the next few months, my outfit was ordered to our naval base at Chinhae, South Korea, mainly for training. World War II at last exploded in Europe on September 3, 1939. 2 months later, I was assigned to one of my rare tours of shore duty. I reported to the naval station at Maizuru, where my duties were to train merchant skippers in combat movements. This was obviously in preparation for any emergency that might arise. This did not mean that the Imperial Navy had already made preparations for attacking Pearl Harbor. The merchant ship training was purely routine in view of the full-scale war developing in Europe. 3 cabinets fell during 1939, indicative of the political crises then boiling in Japan. A cabinet was formed in January 1940 by my old esteemed superior, Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. Admiral Yonai knew Japan would be engulfed in total war once she joined an alliance with the 2 Axis powers. He made Herculean efforts to resist a tripartite pact. Army hotheads believed the Axis was winning the war and would soon end it, dividing all the spoils between Germany and Italy. When they found out they could not persuade Yonai to join the Axis, they simply decided to scuttle his cabinet, and the war minister quit. Under the old Japanese constitution, a war minister had to be an army man, and when General Shunroku Hata resigned in mid-1940, no other general would accept an offer from Yonai. Thus his cabinet fell on July 21st. I did not realize the significance of that event at the time, but today it is clear that his resignation lifted the last roadblock in the way of war in the Pacific. By coincidence, Franklin D. Roosevelt was re-elected that year for his third term as the President of the United States. Soon America and other Allied powers began putting pressures on Japan. Such pressures had no effect but to antagonize the Japanese army leaders who were actually running the nation since the fall of the Yonai cabinet. The next cabinet, under Prince Fumimaro Konoye, concluded the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940. Konoye struggled for a year against the jingoistic army and the Allied economic pressures. Konoye's efforts were not rewarded, and he resigned in October 1941. Japan's oxygen-fueled torpedo remained a well-guarded secret. Not until after the war did the US Navy learn its full characteristics. The 9th of October 1941 is an unforgettable day for me. On that day, there were some 200 warships of the combined fleet assembled in Hiroshima Bay. It was most unusual for the entire combined fleet to gather thus in one place. I was skipper of the 2,500-ton destroyer Amatsukaze, Heavenly Wind, one of 4 similar ships which had just been added to the Second Fleet's Destroyer Squadron 2. These 4 brand-new ships were designated Destroyer Division 16. This was a beautiful autumn day. The anchored warships lay motionless on the surface of the bay. Its mirror-like water reflected the blue mountains of the distant horizon. Countless seagulls skimmed to and fro between the ships. All else was still and peaceful. A signal hoisted from flagship Nagato at 0900 attracted the attention of all lookouts. The flags read, "All ships WYZ." This was an unusual code signal meaning, "All commanding officers will report to the flagship." It started a flurry of activity in every ship. A few minutes later, my motor launch was carrying me toward Nagato. Her spacious stern deck was quickly filling with hundreds of officers, young and old, by the time I arrived. Among those present, I quickly spotted my immediate superiors, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, Destroyer Squadron 2 Commander, and Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, Second Fleet Commander. Everyone appeared grave and serious. The atmosphere was oppressive despite the crisp autumn weather. 3 bells sounded in Nagato, signalling 0930, and all crew members disappeared, leaving on deck only ship captains of lieutenant commander rank and above. The unusual precautions served to increase the tenseness. Commander Hajime Yamaguchi, one of the combined fleet adjutants, shouted from near the podium, "Gentlemen, attention please. The Commander-in-Chief will be here in a moment." We all stood at rigid and silent attention as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto appeared on deck. His steps were clearly audible in the hushed silence as he strode to the podium. Admiral Yamamoto returned our salute and began to speak. "It is an exceeding pleasure for me to see you all on this occasion. Our combined fleet has completed preparations for war. We will continue our training on that basis. The current situation suggests Japan may be forced to take up arms against America, Britain, Australia, and the Netherlands, rather than succumb to strangulation through their blockade. We are undoubtedly in the most serious crisis of our history. Once the nation decides on war against the Allies, it is the duty of combined fleet to defend our nation and defeat the enemy. I believe this task is possible, but only if every one of you exerts his utmost effort. I expect each of you to do his duty along with me, so that we can fulfill our destiny in case of an emergency." Yamamoto's brief words were delivered in a low voice, yet they struck like a thunderbolt. Every officer was stunned. I felt frozen in my place. Admiral Yamamoto clamped his jaws as he stopped talking and looked around as if trying to look into the eyes of each individual. He looked more glum than stern as he walked slowly away from the podium. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, spoke next, giving an analysis of the situation. He told the shocking results of the Allied embargo. Japan was running short of such critical supplies as petroleum, iron ore, rubber, zinc, tin, nickel, and bauxite. He explained the High Command's conclusion that Japan would reach a point of collapse within a year or two if the present situation continued. He said that the High Command had finally adopted a strike-back strategy against the Allied stranglehold. It may be that this meeting of all combined fleet officers, and at this point Ugaki faltered. This may be the last meeting of its kind. We may not be able to see each other again in this fashion. From now on, we are going to undertake the most rigid kind of training. Let me wish for your health. Also, let me caution you. No matter how strenuous the training is, you must always see to it that your men have proper rest and sleep. We must see to it that no man falls from overwork. Each of us must be fit, always, even if we are preparing for certain death. At the end of Ugaki's long briefing, there was a hushed silence. Commander Yamaguchi announced that the meeting was over, and Admiral Yamamoto departed with his staff officers. The others began filing out. I remained stunned, with Yamamoto's and Ugaki's words still ringing in my ears. As a mere commander, it would be some time before my boat would come alongside to take me back to Amatsukaze. Suddenly I shook off my stupor and headed toward the midship hatch. I was determined to talk with Ugaki alone. Our paths had crossed before, so Ugaki was no stranger to me. Twice in the past I had been assigned as an umpire during combined fleet manoeuvres. On one of these occasions, Ugaki had been chief of the umpire panel, and I had then had opportunity to have long discussions with him. As I reached the hatch, a senior admiral emerged, and I saluted hastily. It was my good friend, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, then commander of the 1st Air Fleet. He returned the salute and smiled as he spoke my name, and we exchanged greetings. As he shuffled away, his broad shoulders drooped forward. It occurred to me that his wry smile was little more than a frown. I was startled to see Nagumo in such a mood. Nagamo had always seemed to me a robust and hearty man, who would usually rush up to an old friend, pat his shoulder, and shout excited greetings. The aggressive admiral's queer mood disturbed me as I clambered down the narrow ladder and reached the cabin of Admiral Ugaki. I knocked at the door and entered upon his booming bid to do so. Ugaki was seated at his desk. He was not in a buoyant mood. "Sir, may I talk with you for a few minutes?" I ventured. "Certainly, Hara," he answered. "Be seated." I hesitated, and there was a clumsy silence before my voice came again. "Admiral Ugaki, my behaviour may impress you as an extreme impertinence, but I am doing this entirely on my own discretion, and hope that you will understand. I hope you will not consider me a man who challenges or flinches at drastic orders." "I know you well, Hara. Don't be shy. Go ahead and say what you wish to say. Have you come to discuss the wisdom of opening a naval war against the Allies?" "That's right, sir. I am just a destroyer specialist with a narrow, limited perspective, and certainly am not qualified to criticize a formula worked out by top brains of the High Command. Excuse my outspokenness, Admiral Ugaki, but I am skeptical of this whole strategy. Could we avoid total war by bypassing, say, the Philippines? If it is resources that force us to offensive action, could we not strike at just the Dutch East Indies for the time being?" Ugaki forced a smile, much like Nagumo's. He cleared his throat and said, "I'll tell you, Hara. Your opinion was shared by a number of high-ranking officers, but it was ruled out. The decision has already been made. One thing I must emphasize. We have made the decision and are prepared for the worst. As you know, Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, our ambassador in Washington, is now engaged in last-ditch negotiations for a compromise. Career diplomat Saburo Kurusu will soon join him as a special envoy, and the two will redouble their efforts. We are not seeking war, but if we are given no other choice, we'll have to strike hard and fast. That was the theory finally adopted by the High Command." I groaned silently, realizing that it was of no use to discuss the matter any longer. I asked to be excused, and Ugaki said, "Take care of yourself. You are the best destroyer officer in the Navy. We shall depend on you. See you again, Hara. That meeting, however, turned out to be the last for Ugaki and me. He survived when two twin-engined Betty bombers carrying Yamamoto and his staff were attacked in April 1943 by a score of P-38 fighters. The attack occurred near Bougainville in the Solomons. Both bombers were shot down and Yamamoto was killed. But Ugaki lived until the last day of hostilities when he headed for Okinawa in a suicide bomber on the final kamikaze attack of the Pacific War. To this day, I do not know if Ugaki himself was among those who had opposed the Pearl Harbor attack formula. I have always felt, however, that both he and Nagumo were opposed. Yamamoto was adamant in his insistence on that formula, yet even he was quoted as saying, "The Imperial Navy can fight strongly for only 2 years." Yamamoto was also said to have wished that Japanese statesmen could work out an honourable peace before a catastrophe occurred. I walked back to the deck, still stunned. The younger officers were still gathered around in small groups. I heard one swashbuckling lieutenant commander say, "We destroyer men must forestall and beat the outnumbering enemy. The whole war will probably hinge on our fighting." I nodded and thought to myself, perhaps he is right. I returned to my small cabin in Amatsukaze and took Sun Tzu from the bookshelf. This ancient Chinese classic on strategy and philosophy has been the Bible of warriors for some 2,500 years. The immortal classic opens with this statement: "The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or ruin. Hence it is a subject of inquiry which can on no account be neglected." The third chapter concludes, "In waging war, to conserve one's own nation intact is more important than defeating another nation. To conserve one's own division is more important than to vanquish an enemy division. A commander who fights 100 times and wins 100 times is not the very best commander. A truly great commander wins over an enemy without fighting. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." This advice, sound as it is, failed to provide any solace. I decided that the book was too philosophical and tossed it aside. Its words of wisdom were probably appropriate for a monarch or a commander-in-chief, but not for a low-level officer like me. My glumness continued. While I had been following current events quite closely, I failed to consider that the military leaders could have already decided on war. The historic conference on board Nagato coincided with the resignation of Prince Konoye and his cabinet. His successor was General Hideki Tojo. Belatedly, I realized that this change of regime at such a critical time raised an ominous shadow. For several days I kept groping for a means of preparing myself for total war. After Sun Tzu, I read various Imperial Navy manuals, none of which offered any solution. Do I know the enemy's strength and my own strength? I asked myself. I was called the best destroyer officer. In manoeuvres I was always victorious, finishing off the enemy with accurate torpedo hits. Often I would make my kills by releasing only half of a regular 8-fish salvo. This was an indication of my strength. What was the enemy's strength? I had only a vague idea. If the ratio of the London Disarmament Conference still prevailed, which was highly doubtful since Japan had scrapped the treaty in 1934, the United States and Britain had a combined strength of 10 as against Japan's 3 to 3.5. This would mean I must sink at least 4 enemy ships and keep my own destroyer intact in the war. If every commanding officer in the Imperial Navy succeeded in so doing, we might break even. That was highly improbable. As Admiral Nagumo had told me many times, the tremendous industrial potential of the United States was another formidable unknown factor unfavourable to Japan. It is no wonder that all these thoughts left me gloomy and pessimistic. More days of strenuous effort finally made me realize that I was, after all, a fighting man, not a high-ranking commanding officer. I concluded that my job was to be prepared to fight, and keeping my ship and men intact, sink any opposing ships. I could not allow myself to dwell on the overall problems of war, but must fight to the best of my ability in my limited role. It is strange that in 1941 I should finally find answers to my problems in a book written 300 years earlier, Go-Rin Sho, The Five Wheels, by Musashi Miyamoto. It enabled me to achieve the composure I had long groped for. These are the memoirs of a fabulous swordsman who survived 66 duels and later became one of Japan's greatest artists and philosophers. Compared with Sun Tzu, Miyamoto's memoir is quite obscure. A literal translation of his prose would make little impression on Western readers. Miyamoto was born in 1584 and lived in an age of chaos. As a youth, he was a genius with the sword. To attain sword fame in those days, it was necessary to challenge other swordsmen of reputation, and it was no mere sport. Just as boxers in Western countries formerly fought without rules, Japanese swordsmen in those days often duelled to the death. Their swords were made either of hard wood or razor-sharp steel. When used by an expert, a wooden practice sword could easily maim or kill an opponent, so there was little difference between the two weapons. Miyamoto's 66 consecutive wins, a wonder in any time, are considered and analysed by the battler himself in this book. Throughout his account of these battles runs the consistent theme, not to adhere to any set formula or principle, but to adapt to each situation. This theory is extremely difficult to put into practice, particularly in struggles where a split-second mistake can mean death. Upon reading this, I was positive that here was the solution I had been seeking. By adapting to each situation, I might help to overcome the overwhelming strength of the Allies. I am now convinced that it was because I put this belief into practice that I was able to make a good record in the Pacific War and to survive. Operation Phase 1 was ordered on November 7, 1941. The combined fleet quickly but unobtrusively broke up and scattered. My destroyer, with its 3 sister ships of Destroyer Division 16, quietly slipped into the nearby naval port of Kure. I was unaware that major components of the 1st and 2nd Fleet went north to a rendezvous at Hitokapu-wan, Tankan Bay, in the Kuriles, to become a part of the greatest Japanese task force ever assembled. Our ships were put through a careful check-up in Kure. Non-essential items were unloaded. Sick crew members were ordered ashore, and they were quickly replaced. Only the commanding officers knew what the operation could possibly develop into. Crewmen were told merely that we were going to the South Pacific on a training cruise. The High Command was taking no chances. All leaves and furloughs were cancelled. My last leave had been in September. I had taken a night express train from Kure for the 16-hour ride to my home in Kamakura, a resort town near Yokosuka. But the tiring ride was fully rewarded by the joyous reception I received. My 2 daughters, who leaped and danced in greeting my return, were joined by my son, Mikito, aged 2, who was just beginning to talk. I was able to stay at home only 1 full day. The children grieved at my leaving, and I shared their feeling. I hugged each of them, saying, "Your daddy will be back soon." The recollection made me want to see them again before the operation, which might deny my ever returning home. Operation Phase 2 was ordered on the 21st of November, 1941. On the following day, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's task force was completely assembled in the fog-shrouded bay of Itorafu Island in the Kuriles. On November 23rd, 8 destroyers of Destroyer Divisions 16 and 24 slipped quietly out of the Kure harbour and moved toward Terashima Strait, a familiar training area in northern Kyushu. For 4 consecutive days, we fused and prepared all shells and torpedoes in our ships. Doctors were kept busy administering various shots to the crews. Our 2-division squadron moved out of the strait and headed for the Pacific Ocean at 1800 on November 26th. At the same time, Nagumo's task force sorted from Tankan Bay, headed for Hawaii. Our immediate destination was Palau, in Japan's mandated South Sea Islands. All commanding officers were notified to form a small task force at Palau for attacks on Mindanao Island in the Philippines, simultaneous with the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 2,000-mile cruise from Terashima, our radio transmitters were sealed, as were those of the Nagumo task force. But radio men were working around the clock on their receivers. As our ships departed from homeland waters, there was a radio message. Press reports U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, on 26 November, handed Japanese ambassadors Kichisaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu a note, apparently outlining final U.S. stand on negotiations. As we were passing Formosa on November 28th, we picked up a message from the local headquarters. 2 submarines of undetermined nationality, but presumably United States, observed moving northward in waters east of Formosa. Operation Phase 2 authorized commanding officers to take hostile actions only in absolute necessity. I clenched my fists and spoke on the intercom to my sonar officer. Alert, alert! Possibly hostile submarines reported operating nearby. A professionally cool reply came through. Roger, roger. All sonar gear functioning properly. We'll let you know if anything is picked up. On December 1st, our radio picked up this message. British naval force of 5 warships, including battleship Prince of Wales, is now speeding to the Far East. All the tense atmosphere ended when the green Palau Island emerged on the horizon. We entered its port at 1300 the same day. The climate had changed from winter to summer in 5 days. Green coconut trees on the beach were soothing and restful. But my relaxation was short-lived. The atmosphere in Palau harbour was tense. There were scores of vessels at anchor, including many transports. Soldiers were going through drills, climbing up and down rope ladders on their ships. War appeared close at hand. As I stood on the bridge, my first inclination was to set rigid watches. After a while, however, I decided that was pointless and ordered the ship's store opened for the crew. Everyone was also directed to take a bath, the first since we had left Cura a week before. At the first chance, I took a dozen of my ship's officers to make a study of the harbour topography. Actually, I planned this little excursion as a chance for my boys to relax. We toured the harbour leisurely by boat and had a chance to take it easy for a full day and night. In the evening of the following day, December 2nd, we received a historic radio message from Combined Fleet Headquarters, Nitaka Yamanobore 1208. Literally translated, it meant, "Climb Mount Nitaka, the highest mountain in Formosa, 1208. I gulped at reading this message and felt its significance even before opening the sealed secret cipher book. The words meant, "Start war against the Allies, 8th of December." Shortly afterward, all his ship captains were gathered around Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka for instructions on the Davao attack. In his short briefing, Tanaka repeatedly cautioned, "Remember that negotiations are still being carried on in Washington. We must be prepared at any moment to receive a message calling off the whole operation if negotiations turn out to be successful. Then we do only one thing, turn around and return to Japan." I spoke up. Here at Palau, we are only 500 miles east of Davao, a key American naval base in the Philippines, and 700 miles southwest of another important American naval base at Guam. With so many of our warships assembled here, there must be a number of American submarines keeping watch against us. What should we do in case we contact unfriendly submarines from now on? Tanaka replied, "We shall have to sink them, even though Phase 2 authorized us to take hostile acts only out of absolute necessity." With that, the meeting broke up, and each commanding officer returned to his ship, affecting an air of composure. Actually, it was not difficult to maintain a poker face under the circumstances. I was still sceptical of the wisdom of fighting the Allies, and everything about the plan seemed unreal. I felt, or perhaps wishfully thought, that the operation would be called off at the last moment. An inner voice repeated the words of Sun Tzu, "A truly great commander wins without fighting." I had no inkling that the Imperial High Command had concluded on December 1st that the Hull Note was an ultimatum demanding Japanese capitulation without fighting, and had decided to go to war against the United States and its allies. For 3 days, December 3rd to 5th, we conducted rigid around-the-clock manoeuvres within the harbour. In a final examination of shipboard conditions, all non-essential items were removed. On December 6th, at 01:30, our 6 destroyers and 1 cruiser steamed out of the spacious harbour at Palau. Our mission was to clear the waters of hostile submarines, paving the way for the carrier and 2 heavy cruisers to sail to Mindanao. Many transports standing by in the atoll harbour were scheduled for other parts of the Philippines and also the Dutch East Indies. We steered out of the narrow cut in the western part of the atoll and immediately combed the waters with sonar gear. There was nothing untoward until around 1600 hours the first day out, when the sonar officer reported an alert. What appears to be a submarine, bearing 60 degrees to starboard, distant 2,500 metres. I turned the ship in the indicated direction and barked orders. Prepare to release depth charges. Simultaneously, the ship sounded a long whistle. Signal flags ABX. We are attacking with depth charges. Were hoisted to let my companion ships know of our action. The sonar officer spoke again. 10 degrees to starboard, 2,000 metres. Sound indicates submarine certain. I adjusted Amatsukaze's heading accordingly and proceeded at 12 knots. Looking around, I saw that my men were ready for action at the depth charge launchers, awaiting my next order. The sonar officer continued to report angles and distances as we closed on the target. I was tense with the excitement of a hunter approaching his quarry, but calm with thoughts of myriad details that had to be considered. As we came within striking distance, I realised it was now or never and almost shouted, "Boost speed to 21 knots. Depth charges must be dropped only after a destroyer has boosted its speed, otherwise it will be damaged by its own weapons." But at the last instant I made my decision and swallowed the words. Instead I shouted, "Depth charge action cancelled! Depth charge action cancelled!" It was one of the most important decisions I made during the war. My act on that day may be hard to understand for Western readers who may feel that I disobeyed orders in not carrying out the attack. My decision was based on the following reasoning. The 0 hour was set for December 8th, 2 days hence. It was not warranted to attack a submarine on the high seas before it showed any hostility to us. At the first word of the sonar detection of the submarine, I became involved in a mental struggle. My concern for peace was great. My first thought was whether my present action might wreck the chance for peace. In addition to that lofty consideration, I was also concerned with the tactical situation at the moment. A successful depth charge attack is not easy, particularly when the opponent is expecting it. If the target should escape, the outcome would be quite disagreeable. The submarine would radio its headquarters, and every United States warship would be alerted for the next encounter. When one wavers like that in making a decision, I knew from manoeuvres and practice experience it is doubly hard to score a hit. So I called off the attack. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka was watching me from his cruiser Jintsu, 5,050 tons. He has never questioned me about my queer behaviour of that day. Perhaps he understood and shared my feelings. After giving up the chase of the submarine, I turned around and joined the other ships. Presently we were joined by the carrier Ryujo, with 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers out of Palau. The 12-ship task force assembled in a ring formation, boosted speed to 18 knots, headed straight to the west. We were soon out on the wide ocean, out of sight of all land and even of other ships. From time to time a school of dolphins would catch the eye, but aside from them there was only sea and sky. At the first opportunity, I ordered my crew to assemble on deck and apprised them of our destination and mission. Their calm reaction at hearing this news was a surprise to me. Evidently, they had already sensed the momentous nature of our orders from the extraordinary training and caution that had preceded our sortie. The officers and men returned to their posts. I sat on the bridge and pored over charts of Davao and its environs. The ship was quiet, the ocean calm. Darkness came and all was peaceful. Our ring formation steamed on observing full blackout precautions. Captain Hara, a radio message. I turned toward the courier. Seaman Second Class Takeo Murata had been on board only a month, having come as one of several replacements. The 17-year-old sailor saluted me and stood at attention. I said, "Thanks, Murata," and unfolded the paper he handed me. I felt excitement at the thought that this might be an order countermanding the war operations. It was only an intelligence report. 1 Bristol-class seaplane tender and 1 destroyer anchored in Davao Harbour at 1800 hours the 6th of December. I sighed and resumed the still watch on the dark ocean. Commander Hara, a radio message. Murata was at my side again, sweat dripping from his youthful face. He must have run from the radio room. Good boy. Suddenly I felt sorry for this lad who was sharing the destiny of war with full-grown men. The new message read, "No enemy ship in sight at Legazpi at 1900 hours, 6th of December." The next messages received were 2 press reports. Ambassadors Nomura and Kurusu have resumed talks with Secretary of State Hull and President Roosevelt regarding the latest American proposal. And Foreign Office spokesman said today that passenger ship Tatsuta Maru, which left Yokohama last week for Los Angeles, was instructed to visit Mexico. It is now scheduled to arrive Los Angeles 14th December, depart on the 16th, and arrive at Manzanillo on the 19th. These items certainly implied nothing of a war move. Who could have discerned in these messages that Tatsuta Maru would be ordered to turn around for Japan 30 hours later? The following day, December 7th, passed in similar vein. The tense but monotonous voyage was punctuated for me only by the arrival of routine messages like those of the preceding night. Our second night on the ocean, my watch showed midnight, and the deadline had arrived with no order countermanding the operation. We were still many miles from the attack launching point, 50 miles east of Cape San Agustin and 100 miles east of Davao. Suddenly I felt the strain of 2 days and nights on the bridge and dozed off in my chair, leaving Lieutenant JJG Toshio Koyama, my young but capable chief navigator, in command. Cool drops awakened me when our formation stabbed into a blinding rain squall on the dark ocean. It was 03:30 of D-Day, December 8th, 1941. How stupid to be napping on such an important day. I cursed myself and phoned the radio room for any new messages. There were none. The squall had passed, but I could not shake off my drowsiness. It was awkward and irritating to be so drowsy that I could not concentrate on the war that was about to break. At daybreak, 0500, 20 light bombers and fighters were launched from carrier Ryujo, then 50 miles cast of San Agustin and 100 miles from Davao. The sight of these planes had a rousing and inspiring effect on me. While I still lacked any feeling of enthusiasm for the imminent war, I now stood on the bridge of Amatsukaze as a professional, grimly determined to carry out orders. With the departure of Ryujo's planes, destroyers Hayashio, Natsushio, Kuroshio, and Oyashio broke from our ring formation and dashed forward in column formation at 30 knots for a coordinated attack on American forces in Davao Bay. The other 8 ships fell into line formation, 1,500 meters between each ship, and steamed alternately east and west in this unusual formation, awaiting the return of Ryujo's planes. Ryujo was the only aircraft carrier used in the Philippine operation. It had originally been planned to use her, together with 2 converted carriers, in the attack on Luzon. But their plane-carrying capacity was so limited that it was decided to strike at Luzon with land-based planes from Formosa and use the carriers elsewhere. Ryujo thus moved to Palau, and the 2 slower carriers were sent back to Japan in a last-minute change of schedule. The sun shone intermittently, through occasional breaks in the clouds. There was practically no breeze, and we sweated out 4.5 hours on the ocean in our monotonous back-and-forth marking time movement. 19 of the planes returned to Ryujo at 09:30. The 20th, a bomber, had to be ditched because of engine trouble. We learned later that the crew was rescued by destroyer Kuroshio. The task force attack on Davao was a complete flop. Our planes and destroyers hit an empty bag. The 2 American warships reported they had vanished before our arrival. There was no air or ground opposition to our forces. Our planes strafed and set on fire only 2 American seaplanes, which appeared to have been abandoned in the bay. The planes circled over Davao more than 2 hours. Not a single plane arose from the Davao airfield or from any other base. It was a most peculiar operation. The attitude of American military forces in Davao that day still remains a mystery. Whatever their judgment, they must have notified their headquarters of our onslaught. Yet Manila headquarters sat idle and kept all planes parked on Clark Field when our Formosa-based planes attacked some 4 hours after we had withdrawn from the Davao area. Meanwhile, cruiser Jinsu, with destroyers Hatsukaze and my Amatsukaze, broke away from the task force formation and headed toward the mouth of Davao Bay to join the 4 destroyers returning from their fruitless sortie. The rendezvous was completed at 1400. I was astounded by the endless volume of radio reports of our brilliant exploits at Pearl Harbor and Clark Field. None of it seemed entirely real. I was brought to sudden reality, however, by the appearance of a B-24 bomber. It flew at about 30,000 feet and seemed to have spotted our ships. Admiral Tanaka decided to make a feint before rejoining Ryujo to prevent discovery of our carrier by the American bomber. We made a 180-degree turn and cruised at 18 knots for 1 hour, then turned 90 degrees and ran at 21 knots before switching 60 degrees again to rejoin Ryujo. The B-24 kept rambling overhead without trying to attack, and finally gave up shadowing our ships before we turned toward our original position. This bomber was another mystery to us. Where it came from and what it was supposed to be doing has never been figured out. By the time we got back to the point 50 miles east of San Agustin, new orders came for me and the skipper of destroyer Hatsukaze. Accordingly, we raced toward Legazpi to join the cruisers Mayoko and Nachi, which had gone ahead. The carrier and 2 escorting destroyers had already left for Palau. Admiral Tanaka's flagship Jinsu and the 4 other destroyers followed. I stayed for a week in Legazpi waters, on patrol against American submarines and surface ships carrying possible reinforcements. None appeared, so the duty was boring. But we all knew the importance of safeguarding this rear area in support of the main Japanese landing operation in Luzon. The only excitement I had during the assignment was the 24 hours starting at 17:10 on December 9th, when my radio man monitored a message from submarine I-65 reporting the discovery of 2 British warships which were racing toward the Japanese landing convoy in Malaya. Thereafter, the radio brought a steady stream of reports about the Japanese attack against the British battleship Prince of Wales and cruiser Repulse. Sweat streamed down my face as I read message after message about this action some 1,000 miles away. My immediate feeling about this distant action was complex. It was a mixture of awe and admiration of the British Navy for its quick deployment. Also, I was suddenly full of enthusiasm for battle and a desire to engage the enemy. But these thoughts of participating in the current battle were purely wishful because I had my own assignment where I was. When the first reports came in concerning action against the British ships, I was greatly concerned. There were only 2 Japanese cruiser battleships in Malayan waters at the time. They were Haruna and Kirishima, both 27,500 tons. Built in 1912 and 1913, they were the oldest warships in service in the Imperial Navy. I did not think they would be any match for Britain's unsinkable Prince of Wales and the combat-seasoned Repulse. The flood of early messages from the vicinity of Malaya was bewildering and disturbing. Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto, Commander Destroyer Squadron 3, reported that it would be difficult for his ships to make early contact with the British force. Submarine I-65 reported at 04:30 on the 10th that it had lost sight of the British force because of rain squalls. Then radio signals began to jam each other and no intelligible broadcasts came through to us. It was curious that not a single American warship would come out to fight us in the Philippines. But the British Navy was now driving us panicky all over the area. Atmospherics suddenly cleared at 1400, and we picked up this message. No aerial escorts observed above the British force. Many more messages started coming in rapid succession. 22nd Air Squadron bombs enemy battleship at 1420. Enemy battleship torpedoed at 1430. Aerial torpedo hit direct on enemy cruiser 1440. It now lists heavily to port. 1 of 5 enemy destroyers set afire. 1 enemy battleship exploded and is sinking at 1450. Now I was bewildered. Unbelievable things were happening. Japanese airplanes alone had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor never really impressed me as a measure of air strength, because the enemy was taken unaware. As a destroyer specialist, my perspective was undoubtedly narrow, but the victory against the British in Malaya really shocked me. I had never considered airplanes to be so powerful. My obstinacy was such that even after the spectacular Malayan battle, I could not change my perspective. My confidence had been shaken, but I still believed that since planes were hampered by weather, surface ships must still play a vital role, especially in all-weather battles. Thus, while I was forced to the realization that planes were certain to play an ever-increasing part in warfare, I clung stubbornly to the importance of my own field of interest and endeavour, destroyers. It may well be that this very stubbornness, by maintaining my confidence in destroyers, increased my skill and enabled me to score the successes I did in the Pacific War and still survive so many savage battles. I considered at length the British loss of that battleship and cruiser to aerial attack, but I could not possibly envisage that 3 years and 4 months later Japan would be suffering a parallel loss, and that I would be in command of the Japanese cruiser. On December 15th, the High Command, satisfied with the smooth progress of landing operations at Luzon, no longer deemed it necessary to patrol Legazpi waters, and ordered our ships back to Palau. An American counter-offensive in the Philippines was written off at that time. While refuelling at Palau, further orders arrived for us to escort landing vessels to Davao. At Olo 700 on December 17th, a convoy of 12 transports laden with an army regiment steamed out of Palau in 3 echelons. 7 destroyers and 2 small patrol vessels served as escort. The operation was commanded by Admiral Tanaka in cruiser Jinsu. 45 minutes after leaving Palau, I was standing on the bridge of Amatsukaze when my sonarman reported a submarine just 2,000 meters distant, bearing 80 degrees to starboard. This was almost an exact repetition of what had happened on X-Day. This time there was no hesitation. We closed to 1,000 meters, boosted speed to 21 knots, threw overboard 6 depth charges. Then, turning 230 degrees, we dropped another 6. The charges were set to explode at 30 meters. We observed no indication on the surface of the effectiveness of our efforts. I resumed the escort position at the right wing in front of the second echelon of 4 transports, and the convoy zigzagged on at 10 knots. At 1300 the same day, destroyer Kuroshio on the port wing of the first echelon reported, "Enemy submarine spotted. In cooperation with a friendly anti-sub patrol plane, we attacked it with depth charges. A large quantity of heavy oil floated on the surface. We consider the submarine sunk." This message was dismal news for us in Amatsukaze. I silently showed it to my officers. They groaned in disappointment. On December 20th, before daybreak, the convoy entered the quiet of Davao Bay without challenge from a single plane or ship. A landing operation was not new to me. My experience at Shanghai 5 years earlier had initiated me in enemy gunfire. Our orders at Davao were to hold fire unless challenged. We wanted to occupy the place intact with a minimum of destruction, 2 echelons had already landed successfully farther down the bay. The escort ships moved slowly into the port, which appeared quiet and peaceful. A platoon of my men shoved off from a Matsukaze in a small motorboat with the assignment of disarming and capturing small vessels at anchor in the port. Within minutes, some 200 troops suddenly emerged on the pier and opened fire on my men in the motorboat. A lookout shouted, "Gunfire on boat! Some of our men appear to be hit." I shouted orders. "Port guns, open fire." This was indeed a repetition of the Shanghai landing, a clumsy repetition for which I cursed myself. Our 6 120mm guns rotated and fired. None of the shells hit the enemy, some 2,000 meters away, but they scattered and fled. Second and third salvos followed. The pier was promptly emptied of troops. "Cease fire," I ordered. But the fourth salvo was already on its way. One of the 6 shells hit a small oil tank some 50 meters from the pier, and it burst into flames. The developments in this operation were far from my expectations. I had repeated a series of clumsy mistakes. I was no longer a swell-headed destroyer expert, but a humbled, penitent man who was also disgusted with himself. The motorboat, meanwhile, returned with 1 dead. The following day I officiated at the funeral of Petty Officer 2C Tsuneo Hori, the first of my men to fall in the war. The oil tank burned on for 3 days and nights. For a week after the landing, we were kept busy rescuing Japanese residents of the area. Since Davao had the largest Japanese colony in the Philippines, it was too bad that this operation was so many days delayed. Fortunately, only a few had been killed by retreating enemy troops, and we freed from prison camps the Japanese who had been hurriedly rounded up at the start of the war. It was not long before word came of casualties inflicted on other Japanese destroyers. Ships which took part in the Wake Island operation evidently fared worse than we did at Davao. On December 11th, destroyer Kisaragi was sunk by U.S. Marine planes based at Wake. Hayate, a teammate of Kisaragi, was sunk the same day at Wake by Marine shore batteries. How could they have been so clumsy? But others were still more clumsy, I learned. Destroyer Shinonome hit a mine and sank at Miri, Borneo. Highly classified reports said it was not determined whether the mine was Dutch or Japanese. I was infuriated to learn that destroyer Sagiri was torpedoed and sunk by a submarine, also off Borneo, on December 24th. A cat eaten by a mouse. How could a destroyer be so stupid? It was ascertained later that the successful submarine was the Dutch K-16. Destroyer Kuroshio of my own division, flushed with the achievement of sinking an enemy submarine, also managed to lose face. It was caught napping December 23rd, apparently in the belief that there were no enemy planes around, when suddenly one emerged from out of the sun. This B-17, a flying fortress, came in at low level to drop its bombs, one of which hit the ship and seriously wounded 4 sailors. These stories were never made public. They were buried deep beneath the spectacular Japanese exploits which were given wide publicity. When I learned of the losses, I could not help feeling worried. As has been said, war is a series of mistakes. But Japan could not afford mistakes. My mounting anger at such losses was changing me from the irresolute, wavering skipper of a month before to a new man, fierce and determined. Frustrations continued along with our successes in the early days of the war, and on January 4th, 1942, another occurred which was maddening to me. On that day 14th, major warships, comprising almost the entire Japanese surface force of the area, lay moored in the small harbour of Malalag on the western coast of Davao Bay. The harbour mouth is quite narrow, and the commanding admiral of the fleet had ordered it closed with an anti-submarine net. I was eating lunch when the lookouts shouted, "Air raid." We looked up and saw 9 land-based 4-engine bombers at 30,000 feet. We knew these were enemy B-17s, flying fortresses, because Japan's only 4-engine bombers at that time were Kawanishi flying boats, Emily. Mess gear flew in every direction as officers and men scrambled to get to battle stations and into action. But what could we do? With the mouth of the small harbour closed, we were helpless.